Hello and good afternoon. I'm Deborah Campbell. I'm a professor in the Department of Writing here at UVic, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you today to the annual Harvey Stevenson Southam Lecture. But first I'd like to acknowledge that we are standing on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt, and the Wasanich people, whose traditional relationship continues to this day. The Harvey Southam Lectureship is named after a UVic alumnus and journalist, and it's made possible by a gift from the publishing family, the Southams. And it allows us to bring in top journalists from across Canada to work with our students in the Department of Writing. Today we are particularly honored to have David Beers. He's with us today to talk about a subject about which he knows a lot firsthand, the war on journalists. Many of you will know David as the visionary founder of the Tyee, which he started back in 2003 as a new online, yes. And at the time they were a scrappy startup, a new untried way of doing journalism in the public interest, with a focus on solutions reporting in specific. It's come a long way over the past 20 years. This is their 20th anniversary. And over the years, the Tyee has been honored with countless awards for general excellence by groups like the Edward R. Murrow Awards, the Digital Publishing Awards, and the Canadian Journalism Foundation. And today, it's become really an essential source of quality reporting, especially on BC issues, environmental issues, political issues, Indigenous issues, and over 1 million page views a month at this point, which I would say makes it, if not the most successful, certainly one of the most successful experiments in independent journalism in Canada today. And back before he started the Tyee, Dave was a senior editor at the San Francisco Examiner, Mother Jones magazine, and also at the Vancouver Sun. So he's seen the traditional newsrooms, magazines, as well as the online world. And as an award-winning magazine writer in his own right, he taught for many years at the UBC Graduate School of Journalism, training journalists for the next generation, a few of whom I actually see here today. So that's really great as well. So this is also one of the things he's doing here for us this term is he's teaching a solutions reporting class to students here at UVic. The full title of Dave's lecture, after which there will be time for your questions, is The War on Journalists. Who is waging it and why, and what's at stake if they win? Given what we've seen only in the past week with the well-respected news site Capital Daily losing half of their staff, not to mention the ever-growing list of cuts and closures to both newsrooms small and large across the country, which seems almost a weekly event. It couldn't be a better time to hear from him. So please join me in welcoming David Beers.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for inviting me to speak and be tangled up immediately in my microphone cord. What an incredible honor to be able to give this talk. So many brilliant people have preceded me. Last year, it was Andrew Nikiforuk, who writes quite a bit for the Tyee. And my talk is going to be pretty sober, pretty serious, but it can't be nearly as much of a downer as Andrew Nikiforuk. So that's something, right? Okay. So let's face it, we can all feel it. The ground is shifting beneath us. It feels as if a void is replacing the solid, if squeaky floor that we all took for granted. The floor I'm speaking of is a simple, basic shared assumption. that however we might disagree ideologically, our conversation must begin with shared facts, because from such facts can flow reasonable decisions. The assumption that knowing the facts is essential to holding accountable those to whom we've entrusted power. That having facts on one side, when push comes to shove in our democratic discourse, is how to be strong and succeed. That liars and fantasists might catch our attention for a moment the way circus clowns do, but we assumed they will be found out, shown up, discredited as weak fools who just gum up the democratic conversation in which we must engage. All this we have assumed because we live in a material, tangible world. And so the consequences of decisions made by those in power can be researched and can be reported as facts. And the prime source of such facts for the citizenry for the last century or so here in Canada has been the news media. And its job description has been a big one. Harvest facts global, national, regional, local, and hyperlocal. All the news fit to print about who did what yesterday and today and what they are hankering to do tomorrow. Harvest to the facts that no one puts in a press release. Facts that can be pried loose only by proactive investigation. We call the people who do this job journalists. And until about the last decade or so, nobody worried about the well-being of journalists, much less the ongoing existence of their role in society. Because like roads and schools and supermarkets, they were just basic infrastructure. So tonight I'm going to argue that journalists are increasingly endangered in Canada, not because, as in other countries such as the Philippines, Mexico, or Russia, they are actually jailed or murdered by those who are threatened by their fact-finding. The slow liquidation of the ranks of journalists in this country is being carried out by other methods, including one, the destruction of an economic model that we took for granted. Two, the resulting drying up of resources to do the kind of journalism that is rigorous, ethical, responsible, journalism carried out in the public interest. Three, the erosion of journalists' standing in our democratic conversation because the internet changed the power dynamics. And four, the increasing mental health hazards of doing journalism, including injuries inflicted by vicious online trolling. And five, a global movement that aims to destabilize democracies and replace them with modes of government that hew towards authoritarianism. This movement has again and again named journalists its enemies. About number five. At this moment when democracy is back on its heels so obviously just to our south and around the world, Canadians should not consider themselves immune from similar conditions. Foes of democracy who are would-be autocrats must first destroy a shared sense of reality. And there is evidence we are headed down that path. Indeed, the war on journalists, as I will argue, is part of a war on reality itself. I will argue that this war is allowed to gain steam because Canadians' awareness of what is at stake and our national response to date is thin. Here is a definition of war by scientist and philosopher Jacob Bronowski. He terms it, quote, a highly planned and cooperative form of theft. And so the question arises, who seeks to steal from us journalism in the public interest, which happens to be a bulwark of democracy? Which invites further questions commonly asked by investigative journalists. Who stands to benefit? Who would gain from so massive a disruption? Let me tell you a bit of my background and in the process share with you a more elaborate definition of what I mean by a public interest journalist. My resume is a lot more checkered than the one that Deborah kind of glossed up there. But the basics are that I grew up in California's Santa Clara Valley as it was becoming Silicon Valley. And I held progressive values from an early age. And through my education and the books and magazines and newspapers that I read, I came to believe, as Martin Luther King stated, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So I was a Watergate kid. That's how old I am. I was a Watergate kid who saw investigative reporting not only expose the president's law-breaking, but help halt the Vietnam War, alert us to environmental threats, and shift society towards positive social change in myriad other ways. As a young journalist, I reported on refugees from a scorched earth campaign waged by the US-backed military regime in Guatemala. And I chronicled the precarious workforces of California's farm fields and tech plants. I gathered visual evidence with my camera and fact upon fact in my notebooks. By the time I'd become an editor and writer at Mother Jones magazine in the late 80s, the rules were clear to me. To be a journalist with any impact required adhering to rigorous methods. Mother Jones's fact-checking department was ferocious. They verified every word in every piece we published. We understood that the issues we chose to investigate, the questions we chose to pursue, were informed by progressive values. Nevertheless, the floor we built our muckraking magazine upon had to be thoroughly buttressed. It had to be rock solid in the face of challenge by anyone. Otherwise, the information we sought to share could be easily dismissed as cant, and we'd be denied participation in the wider democratic conversation. The price of admission to that vital exchange was fact-based credibility. So were we activists? Am I an activist? Emphatically, I say no. I've always understood the lane I chose, and I have stayed in it. The journalistic principles I adhered to at Mother Jones, I adhered to previously when I was a writer and editor for the Hearst Corporation-owned San Francisco Examiner, and later when I wrote for National Geographic, or Vancouver Magazine, or the Los Angeles Times, or still later when I served as an editor at the Vancouver Sun. They are the same principles that define the Tyee, which I founded in Vancouver 20 years ago. We at the Tyee abide by a code that insists we must be able to substantiate and verify anything we publish. We understand that there are substantial consequences when we fail. Beyond professional humiliation and loss of credibility, there lies the potential of being sued for libel. Tell me about it. So yes, it is possible to be a person with progressive values who understands the overriding value of journalism's principles. Talking to all sides, reporting for context and nuance, and getting it right. Ensuring the story could live on its own among skeptical readers who demanded facts over spin. As a young journalist, I readily accepted these strictures and understood them to be the harness one slipped on if you expected to command wide attention, which in turn was necessary to make an impact towards positive social change. So let us pause to contemplate which figures just a few decades later dominate the political conversation today in the nation where I came of age. The output of the entire staff of the New York Times merits 8.6 million paid digital subscribers. Each Spotify podcast by Joe Rogan, a former stand-up comic and reality TV show host, pulls in 11 million listeners. Joe Rogan is anything but a journalist restrained by the code that I described. When he was criticized because he risked lives, maybe killed people, by giving a favorable platform to anti-vax quacks, he shrugged and apologized for not bothering to vet his guests before putting them on. He said he would try and do better. Consider the bizarre offerings of Tucker Carlson on Fox News, whose cable TV leading average nightly audience often tops 4 million. Carlson has said there is no such thing as a white supremacist. and that Trump's foes were the ones who organized the assault on the Capitol. He has devoted many shows to the premise that, quote, the end of men is nigh. But, he says, it might be staved off if men spent more time exposing their testicles to sunlight. I don't make that up. Google it up. But then Carlson has defended himself from libel suits by his lawyers arguing he should never be considered anything like a journalist. And people should not take him seriously. In fact, here is a 2021 quote from Tucker Carlson. Quote, I lie. I really try not to. I try never to lie on TV. I certainly do it, out of weakness or whatever. Close quote. Last week, the admitted liar Carlson, who relentlessly defended the champion liar Donald Trump, defended the natural product of our times, newly installed member of Congress, George Santos, who has lied, it seems, about everything. His name, his election money, his resume, his Ponzi scheme grift, his college diplomas, and even his fake volleyball stardom. Did the floor beneath us just melt away a little more? Are you feeling queasier? We in Canada cannot escape the undertow because the internet knows no borders. The sort of nonsense I've just referenced lives on and resonates via the web's echo chambers. This time last year, Elon Musk declared Canada's government illegitimate. His evidence, pictures of lots of angry truckers rolling into Ottawa. He told his then 63 million Twitter followers, quote, it would appear that the so-called fringe minority is actually the government. And he said, quote, if the government had the mandate of the people, there would be a significant counter-protest. There is not, therefore they do not, close quote. He said this as if pointing to the invisible output of one of his engineering equations. Musk's logic, of course, fails the most basic tests. Nearly 90% of Canada's truckers were vaccinated, so the convoy was not representative even of drivers, much less the nearly 3 out of 4 polled Canadians who believe truckers should be vaccinated or have to prove they are COVID-free at the border. Musk also ignored the actual far-right fringe minority, extremists tied to the convoy, and the hate some of them spew. In the years since, Musk's Twitter following has doubled to 128 million followers. And of course, he now owns the platform. Musk's first tweets upon taking ownership were to spread a baseless story, smearing the husband of the US Speaker of the House, who was assaulted with a hammer in his home by a stranger, who was an unhinged disciple of Trump's big lie about a stolen presidential election. Musk spread that BS story via tweet, and it took actual journalists very little time to debunk that fake news. But Musk plainly has little regard for journalists. To him, they are not normal people. Journalists, quote, think they're better than everyone else, he said after suspending some from Twitter. He later amended, quote, not all journalists are bad, but far too many are, close quote. Meanwhile, he dissolved Twitter's panel that checks postings for their truthfulness, fired much of Twitter's team focused on combating misinformation, and reinstated the accounts of a number of proven, persistent purveyors of lies. This caused Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists to send him a letter voicing, quote, alarm. Whether Musk believes members of those organizations to be among the far too many bad journalists, we don't know. We do know that he himself is a prime spreader of misinformation on Twitter, promoting fact-free narratives about, for example, the pandemic. Early on, he said it would be over in a month and railed against public health measures. Recently, he has absurdly called for the prosecution of former chief White House medical advisor Anthony Fauci. Why would Elon Musk spend $44 billion to buy so important a platform for conducting our democratic conversation and then do his best to make it a swamp for misinformation? Tech barons need good info to succeed, do they not? Why demonize journalists when so many inhabit his platform? In his brilliant new book, The Chaos Machine, about the rise and impact of social media, New York Times reporter Max Fisher documents the anti-democratic philosophies that guide some of our most powerful tech barons. In a December series of tweets, Fisher tells it this way, quote, "People really need to understand how mainstream it has become in some tech venture capital circles to argue that journalism itself is dangerous as an idea and should be abolished, and that it will be up to the tech world to carry this out." Quote, "It comes out of a Silicon Valley utopianism that has said since the 90s that all legacy institutions are ultimately barriers to progress, but that the enlightened minds of the tech world, guided by the pure science of engineering, will one day liberate us by smashing the old ways." Fisher goes on to say, quote, "The idea of rejecting institutions to build a purer society on the internet, in vogue in tech in the 90s, by the 2010s had become a mandate to abolish and remake those institutions in big tech's image." Fisher's book quotes a 22-year-old Mark Zuckerberg perceiving society as mere code to be hacked, saying, quote, "I can break down this system and make it better." The book also quotes Peter Thiel proclaiming in 2009, quote, "I no longer believe freedom and democracy are compatible." Thiel, who co-founded PayPal with Musk, is a major financial backer of Trump and other Make America Great candidates. Fisher quotes Thiel concluding, quote, "Only companies like Facebook could safeguard liberty. And only," writes Fisher, paraphrasing Thiel, "if companies like Facebook were unshackled from politics, which seems to mean regulation, public accountability, and possibly the law." By 2020, top Silicon Valley venture capitalists were gathering on a private online site called the Clubhouse to openly question whether journalists should even have the right to investigate private companies. They were mad that journalists find out stuff, which prevents tech finders from attracting and making lots of money while they remake society. In his tweet thread, Fisher sums up their self-serving rubric. Quote, "Their deep belief is that the defining battle of our time is between tech companies that want to liberate us and dying institutions like the news media, trying to halt that progress out of a desperate bid for survival. Only by destroying those institutions can big tech save humanity," he writes. And he goes on, quote, "There's been a movement for a few years now among many of big tech's most powerful venture capitalists to mass block, even try to harass or ban news reporters as a class. Journalism is unwelcome in the new digital utopia. And that's the circle from which a certain new Twitter CEO comes," says Fisher. Of course, not every believer in the transformative effects of the internet were so adamantly anti-democratic. I remember being in San Francisco with some of those same early tech barons and in the making, and feeling a kind of energy around the internet that it could have hugely transformative democratic possibilities. And so for some high-profile thinkers, web-based journalism promised that everyone finally would be let in on the conversation that had been too tightly moderated by journalists working at established organizations. The internet was going to level the playing field. And that would be good not only for citizens, but for journalists too, and democracy itself. One such voice was influential New York University journalism professor Jay Rosen. But in December of 2020, Rosen appeared on Twitter to issue a powerful mea culpa for, quote, "a big thing I got disastrously wrong," close quote. His error goes directly to why the ground beneath us now feels so flimsy. It explains how internet culture deepens misunderstanding and mistrust of what journalists bring to the democratic discourse. And his realization bodes well only for those who would profit from a war on reality. Rosen's original 2009 essay was about this diagram, invented by a professor of communication named Daniel Hallen. As Rosen explained, quote, Hallen proposed that we think about the political influence of journalists by imagining three spheres. The sphere of consensus, core beliefs that make us one society, that's the center of the donut. And then the donut itself is legitimate controversy, things we disagree on and argue about. Outside the donut, the sphere of deviance. That's the next Marvel Universe movie. Outside the donut is the sphere of deviance, which is beyond the pale. And in other words, things that everyone agree isn't worth discussing because it's so crazy. So in this diagram, Rosen noted, quote, the sphere of legitimate debate is familiar terrain for journalists. It is where most of their work takes place. The donut. In the sphere of deviance, says Hallen, are political actors and views which journalists in the political mainstream of society reject as unworthy of being heard. So this diagram is a diagram of, this donut is a diagram of contested spaces. As consensus about what is beyond the pale and what is worth discussing evolve, noted Rosen, quote, things can move out of one sphere and into another. So I can see why Rosen saw potential in this diagram. A lot of us can think of issues we don't think get nearly enough attention in the mainstream media, which means the social change we'd like to see is slowed and stymied. Journalism itself could use a great deal more democratization, I agree. And that's what Rosen thought when he noted, Hallen's model opens space for critique. Journalists are not only gatekeepers, but sphere sorters. Part of their power is to police the boundaries between the spheres of deviance and legitimate debate. And this caused frustration, Rosen said. Quote, these decisions are often invisible to the people making them. And so we can't even argue with these people. It's like trying to complain to your kid's teacher about the values the child is learning in school when the teacher insists that the school does not teach values. But Rosen saw a new day coming, thanks largely to social media. He said, and this was back in 2009, previously, in the age of mass media, the press was able to define the sphere of legitimate debate with relative ease because the people on the receiving end were atomized. We all received information alone. There was no way to then share it through an internet. And equally important, we were without the tools needed to self-publish and share. Says Rosen, but now we had the internet. People were connected to each other and to the media. They could pool their frustrations, criticize the calls that journalists made, and make their own. What's in bounds, what's out. In 2009, Rosen celebrated what he called, quote, the falling cost for like-minded people to locate each other, share information, and realize their number. Quote, among the first things these like-minded people may do is establish that the sphere of legitimate debate, as defined by journalists, doesn't match up with their own definition. But 9 years later, 11 years later, I got that wrong. 11 years later, Rosen was dismayed to see what he'd failed to predict. Now he says where we've arrived is frighteningly obvious. The falling cost for like-minded people to locate each other permits not only the criticism, but the utter rejection of journalism. The falling cost for like-minded people to locate each other makes possible the mass delusion known as QAnon. It enables the Trump cult to detach itself from anything verifiable and spin off into resentment space. Rosen concludes, the falling cost for like-minded people to locate each other and share their truth is an integral part of a bewildering fact. Today, realism counsels us not to assign too much power to reality. The rise of social media has had another deeply damaging effect on journalists who once played so large a role in mediating our donut of democratic discourse. It has laid waste to the advertising model that largely paid their salaries. Facebook's riches are based on a simple proposition. Far better and more cheaply than old-fashioned news media companies, it can deliver advertisements to receptive audiences that its own algorithms attract, sort, and target. It does so without the pesky need to employ journalists. Indeed, it refuses to name itself a publisher, avoiding legal responsibility for the subject matter that flows to its 2 billion members. Before social media, when I worked at the Vancouver Sun as an editor from 1998 to 2001, the newsroom was home to nearly 100 journalists. They were by and large very skilled and dedicated to the code of practice I described earlier in our talk. Next door, actually one floor up, the province's newsroom was just a bit smaller. Today, I'm told by sources, the Sun and province's merged newsrooms number about 50 people in total. And on any given day, less than 10 of those are reporters available to dispatch to stories. That's about the same number on staff at the Tyee. The meteor that struck the Sun's newsroom planet is the internet. When I was there in the late 1990s, advertising, not subscriptions, made up about 85% of Sun and province revenue. The first internet shock was that ads online commanded but a tenth of the price of print ads. But readers seemed destined to move online without any desire to pay offsetting higher subscriptions. They had been trained to think that media was pretty much free. So the Sun was slow to erect a paywall, even as ad revenues dropped. That's Mark Zuckerberg, if people don't know. The next shockwave arrived in 2005 as Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook joined Google to begin commandeering much of the news media's online advertising. As resources dwindled, the first to go was expensive journalism, such as long-form, in-depth investigations. 15 years ago, most large and even mid-sized city papers in Canada had investigative units, or at least veteran journalists, afforded the time and legal support to do deep dives to hold power accountable. Those days appear to be all but over. After years of regulators greenlighting consolidation by the big media owners, Canada has some big corporate brands who lean leftish or rightish, but they have been pleading poor for years. Torstar, a major newspaper chain helmed by the Toronto Star, has shuttered many local papers in recent years. So has Postmedia, owner of the Vancouver Sun and Province and National Post. Postmedia announced yet another round of layoffs just last month, more than a tenth of its workforce. Torstar, Postmedia, and other large chains receive millions of dollars in labor subsidies from the federal government, ostensibly to help them eventually transition to internet sustainability. But their financial prospects continue to diminish. The case can be made that years of media ownership concentration through mergers that pile up debt has placed much of Canadian journalism in a terribly precarious position. In a recent piece published by the CBC, Patricia Elliott, a distinguished professor of investigative and community journalism at First Nations University of Canada, lays it out forcefully. She writes, "Last week's announcement of Postmedia staff cuts and property fire sales is but the latest outrage in a scenario foretold by decades of federal commission testimonials. If you allow our newspapers to fall into the hands of a few debt-ridden would-be tycoons fronting for foreign hedge funds, the failures will be catastrophic." She's just getting warmed up. Quote, "Canada's Competition Bureau has miserably failed to avoid this path, greenlighting monopolistic newspaper purchases against all public interest and common sense. Meanwhile, federal officials tasked with guarding Canadian ownership stood by as the fate of more than 100 Canadian newsrooms was handed off to foreign shareholders." Elliott reveals a disturbing truth that not many Canadians know. because we're told there's a logic driving the regulatory decisions and government policies regarding our news media. The primary goal, we've been told, is that Canada, in the shadow of the US behemoth and global conglomerates, must maintain control of its news media. So, do what's necessary to prop up our news corporations, even if that means these mergers. Except, as Elliot writes, the true owner of Postmedia, and thus, quote, my local newspaper, is Chatham Asset Management, a hedge fund in New Jersey. The second largest shareholder, Alliance Global Investment, has offices from Shanghai to Frankfurt. Its main US fund was shut down over securities fraud and ordered to pay back billions to bilked investors. Quote, the third largest investor, Leon G. Cooperman, survived insider trading allegations by taking the Fifth Amendment in court and handing a $5 million settlement to the US Securities Exchange Commission. Quote, I wonder how much of my local newspaper's revenues helps pay for such peccadillos, writes Elliot. It's a trend I've long tracked uneasily. In fact, it's why I was motivated to launch the Tyee as an experiment to see if the emerging internet could foster homegrown, locally controlled news organizations. Small organizations where journalists could pursue the investigative and solutions-focused deep dives that they really were primed to do. Local control seemed essential to me. Elliot says the same in her searing commentary. She observes, locally owned papers tend to do comparatively well in the media market. However, as demonstrated by the sorrowful history of media concentration, press barons will shutter newspapers rather than offer them to local buyers. At best, they'll sell the whole chain to another sprawling, indebted corporation. Sadly, she says, we've reached a point where even if one link were broken off the chain, its physical assets will have been stripped and swallowed into the maw of CEO bonuses and company debt. All that's left to buy is a once proud banner and a payroll liability, concludes Elliot. Last month, Postmedia sold off the Calgary Herald's headquarters building. If grafting giant legacy media chains onto the internet hasn't worked well in Canada, does that not leave open the potential for some tech-savvy entrepreneur to start from scratch to build a sustainable journalism model? And wouldn't the most likely opportunity lie in local news, where the retrenchment of big media is leaving the market open? So that was the thinking behind the launching of Overstory Media Group here in Victoria in 2021 by local multimillionaire tech investor Andrew Wilkinson. I don't know, if you're here, let's catch up afterwards. Seriously. A story that made this headline in the Guardian newspaper. A journalism school dropout in 2019, Wilkinson already had launched Victoria's Capital Daily, which became the flagship for Overstory as the company set an ambitious 3-year goal of starting or acquiring 50 publications and employing 250 journalists, serving small to mid-sized metro regions across Canada. Wilkinson explained he loved reading the New York Times and wanted to figure out how to pump that kind of reporting back into Victoria and other lightly served communities. Here was a tech star who loved journalists. Wilkinson's experiment was watched very closely by me and anyone else itching to know whether public interest journalism was still the sort of profit-making business that could attract venture capital and turn a profit in Canada. There was plenty of reason to think not. In the US, hundreds of millions have flowed into such ventures as Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Vice, and other flashy news sites, and just about all have either foundered or failed to meet financial expectations. Me, well, with Tyee publisher Jeanette Aitchison, I'd long ago come to the conclusion that the Tyee should be a non-profit standalone, anchored by its special relationship with its members, who provide through monthly contributions of $15 the bulk of our revenue. We at the Tyee had seen that angel investment, philanthropic contributions really, by wealthy patrons of journalism were also key to our survival. We could not be where we are today without the stewardship of patrons Eric Peterson and Christina Monk, and earlier working enterprises at SUTS. We have tinkered for 2 decades with our model, which also includes arm's length funding from government and foundations, and yes, some advertising. After all that, no one could look at the Tyee and see a template for quickly establishing 50 siblings across the nation. We are a product of our distinct ecosystem, and we are, in my mind, not a model for market players. Instead, we should be viewed as a plucky response to market failure. But now, in Andrew Wilkinson, here came a business person, obviously wiser than I, pouring millions into Overstory and declaring as of last year, the Capital Daily already was making a profit. And they were doing it by publishing in-depth journalism in the public interest. So well honed that usually there was just one major piece a day. Part of their model was to push that original content out in a buzzy email newsletter that curated the significant work of other news outlets and listed briefs about doings at City Hall and ways to have fun. Hey, if it worked, as far as I was concerned, there was hope after all. Last week, Wilkinson and Overstory CEO Farhan Mohammed announced the layoff of Capital Daily's editor and 3 top reporters, saying the numbers no longer worked. Projected losses loomed too large. Remaining staff are said to be reeling. Reportedly, a shift in editorial content is in the offing. The jury is still out, of course, and I am rooting for an Overstory rebound. But if Wilkinson and his Overstory attempt have done us the service of demonstrating how difficult it is to build a 2.0 version of for-profit online news chains in Canada, then we do owe him a bit of thanks. We are one more step closer to the place where I feel we must arrive in this country. Journalism must be recognized to be an embattled public good, profitable or not, a public good essential to the functioning of our democracy. If it can't be sustained by If it can't be sustained by distant hedge fund owners or local tech investors, we must creatively imagine together other ways to do so. But we have the CBC, I hear you thinking. Yes, thank goodness we do. And thanks for having me on this morning, CBC. But to consider the CBC the solution to all I've discussed here is to ignore 2 things. One, the CBC isn't everyone's cup of tea. A truly healthy journalism landscape would be far more diverse than one mother corp. And 2, we are always one election away from a massive hit to the CBC budget. A recent poll showed that nearly half of Canadians strongly or somewhat support defunding the CBC. Defunding the CBC has become a rallying cry of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Without a robust CBC, what is Canada's plan B? If, in fact, there is a war on journalists, so far I've only presented you with a loose bunch of collaborators. Tech barons with strange philosophies, celebrity pundits subverting fact-based reality, media owners who are either inept or parasitically destructive, regulators asleep at the watch. You might shrug and say, okay, journalists don't have it as good as they used to. But Dave, that seems to be just because digital technologies that people like and invite into their lives have scrambled your neat little diagram of the role that journalists should play in a healthy democracy. Can't stand in the way of progress, Dave. But this progress is enabling a dangerously reactionary moment around the world. I am speaking of the global assault on democracy fueled by populist worship of cultish leaders. In Brazil, it was Bolsonaro. In the Philippines, Duterte. In Hungary, Orban. In Russia, the consummate autocrat, Putin. Our North American prototype is Donald Trump and his Make America Great movement. And Donald Trump's Svengali was this person, Steve Bannon. In 2012, Bannon famously took over a website called Breitbart when its namesake died, and he turned it into a laboratory for fomenting populist anger at the farthest alt-right margins. Bannon is a massive egotist, but he learns. Here is what Bannon says he learned working in Hong Kong's online gaming industry in the 2000s. That many men leading dull, unfulfilled lives in the real world not only enjoy creating alternative selves online, but the action there actually feels more real to them because the drama and the stakes feel higher. It's a lesson he applied when constructing the male-dominated comment section of Breitbart. Quote, this became more of a community than the city they live in, the town they live in, the old bowling league, he told documentary maker Errol Morris. Quote, the key to these sites was the comment section. This could be weaponized at some point in time. The angry voices properly directed have latent political power, he said. As we saw come to fruition at the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. As a student of the online psyche, Bannon co-founded Cambridge Analytica, a company that applied psychological warfare techniques to online campaigning. Eventually, the company got into hot water by tapping the personal data of tens of millions of Facebook users without permission, but not before Bannon's skills at manipulating public opinion landed him a key role in Trump's campaign and then as Trump's chief strategist in the White House until the two narcissists clashed and Bannon was out. His next stop was Europe to rally proto-fascist movements, and now he broadcasts a streamed online TV show called The War Room that, banned from YouTube, still pumps paranoid lie after lie and hosts the likes of disgraced school shooting denier Alex Jones. What does Bannon hope to achieve? A former White House colleague of Bannon told Atlantic writer Jennifer Senior that way too many conversations with Bannon ended with Bannon saying, quote, then we burn it all down. Just burn it down. The source said it was never clear as to what it was. Congress, the establishment, Washington, D.C., the country as he perceived it, the world order, the source told Senior. But if you want to burn it all down, here's what Trump's master strategist learned is key. Quote, the Democrats don't matter, Bannon told author Michael Lewis in 2018. Quote, the real opposition is the media. Quote, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. Now, where did Steve Bannon learn that? Well, it's straight from the totalitarian playbook. It's certainly the logic that drives Russian disinformation campaigns, a tactic the US Rand Corporation describes as, quote, a fire hose of falsehoods. The Russian practitioners themselves call it false information with a purpose. Expert Trygve Olsen explains the well-known methods of planting fake conspiracy theories in order to confuse and shatter social cohesion and foster extremists. The techniques flow from 4 psychological factors, and here I'm quoting Olsen, quote, the first is psychological distress. I'm worried about ... The distress leads to a desire for answers to explain why. Distress in politics comes as grievances, real or contrived. Either way, people are looking for answers. The second is cognitively simplistic answers. Often the solution to problems, whether personal or societal, are complicated. We desire calming answers. Extremism occurs when simple answers to complex problems are offered. The third step on the path to extremism is overconfidence. People who become extremists through simple answers become overconfident in their beliefs and explanations. I have the answer. I want to share it with others. And here, let me interject that other experts have noted that disinformation monkey wrenchers exploit this trait by sprinkling the internet with kernels of false narratives in various real-seeming sites and forums, which provides a trail of fake crumbs for the gullible person doing my own research. Back to Olsen. Quote, the fourth phase is intolerance. Those who become extremists have the answers and struggle with those they believe don't see what they do. Those who don't are a threat. For the extremists, those who don't share their beliefs become dangerous, political enemies. These are the people in the comment section of Breitbart that Bannon wanted to weaponize. and this is how it's done. If there ever was a zone designed so that it could be flooded with that kind of shit, it is the internet. Faced with this limitless opportunity, it is up to the owners of each platform to decide how much sewage to allow to flow. It really comes down to profit, and profit is a function of how the algorithms are tweaked. Terry Canfield, an American author, lawyer, and sharp observer of internet culture, explains why, quote, people who are monetizing their social media feeds are often the ones writing content that arouses your emotions. She notes, quote, rage-inducing content helps the content provider by attracting a large audience. It also helps the social media platform by increasing overall engagement. Rage generators and for-profit social media platforms thus have a common goal. They work together. Keep people riled and angry, thus driving polarization and extremism. Isn't it nice to not look at Steve Bannon for a minute? Much rather look at Hannah Arendt, the brilliant 20th century philosopher about the roots of Nazism and other forms of totalitarianism. She would recognize this virtual landscape as fertile ground for the rise of movements primed to embrace a cult-like political figure. Such movements flourish, she said, when citizens feel atomized and isolated, and who have come to despair that existing parties and institutions can render meaning to their lives and imaginations. They seek a totalizing narrative of struggle and victory, and the movement leader provides it. As Arendt scholar Roger Berkowitz writes, quote, movements thrive on the destruction of reality. Because the real world confronts us with challenges and obstructions, reality is uncertain, messy, unsettling. Movements work to create alternate realities that offer adherents a stable and empowering place in the world. Amid economic dislocation and the loss of stable identities, the Nazis' promise of Aryan superiority is stabilizing. Above all, movements promise consistency. And here he quotes Arendt. Such movements, quote, conjure up a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself. Welcome to the endless culture war, waged on the internet and cable TV. Its proponents often masquerade as journalists, but they are not, by my definition of the craft. Public interest fact-finding is irrelevant when the goal is to keep pushing emotional buttons in order to maintain a consistent narrative that godless, world-dominating socialists are bent on destroying all you hold dear. Pick your sign of the apocalypse. Is it that the maker of M&Ms have desexualized their cartoon versions of spokes candies? Is it that teaching about slavery in schools is a nefarious plot called critical race theory? Is there a drag queen, gasp, holding a story time at your local library? These eruptions are an endless flood of shit, calling the lonely, atomized citizen to war against the woke. It is tempting to feel above it all, to consider such debates the preoccupations of small minds. But journalist and podcaster Sam Adler-Bell reminds us that the stakes are high. In an essay about how scaremongering about critical race theory fueled the electoral transformation of many US school boards, who are now banning books and supporting broader changes in government higher up the chain, Bell writes, quote, for many traditional policy thinkers, the term culture war carries a connotation of irrelevance or frivolity, a distraction from more concrete and consequential battles over economic or foreign affairs. But the implication is unearned, he writes. In 1990, borrowing the phrase from German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who knew, the American sociologist James Davidson Hunter defined culture war as, quote, competition to define social reality. In other words, why are things the way they are, writes Bell. Which brings us back to Steve Bannon, though we don't have to look at him, and his aim to burn it all down. What was Cambridge Analytica? Quote, this was Steve Bannon's baby, said a former contractor named Christopher Wiley, turned whistleblower. He called it, quote, Bannon's arsenal of weaponry to wage a culture war on America using military strategies. Why are the spoils of such a war fought to steal from us, or what are the spoils of such a war fought to steal from us our reality-based democracy? The spoils are the reins of tremendous power. After Trump was elected by narrow margins in 2 key swing states, a US Senate report revealed that a Russian-based outfit called the Internet Research Agency, or IRA, operated thousands of social media accounts, interacting with tens of millions of unknowing Americans. Terry Canfield relates, the IRA even staged real events in the US, using a Facebook page called Heart of Texas, which had attracted over 250,000 followers. IRA agents organized a Stop Islamization of Texas rally in 2016 in front of the Islamic Dawah Center in Houston. At the same time, the same IRA operatives used their United Muslims for America Facebook page with 325,000 followers to promote a second event to be held at the same time in the same place called Save Islamic Knowledge. Protesters from both sides showed up, as was the intention of the Russians. Violence broke out. The competing events were covered live by local news agencies. They didn't know both protests had been organized by Russian operators. And, quote, IRA agents posted biblical verses on a page designed to attract white evangelicals. Nothing wrong with that. That's what the internet's for. White evangelicals who were attracted to the site believed they were interacting with like-minded Americans. After building their trust, the IRA agents posted lies about Hillary Clinton, writes Canfield. The night Trump's election was announced, most journalists I know scratched their head in wonder and dread. The ground clearly had shifted beneath their feet. It crumbles further with the prospect that an increasingly unhinged Donald Trump, twice impeached and facing numerous lawsuits, remains the front runner for the Republican presidential candidate in 2024. We know the dynamic I have just traced has transformed the political culture of other nations. Nobel Prize-winning Filipina journalist Maria Ressa has said, quote, what happened in the Philippines would not have happened if Facebook wasn't there. 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet, she said. Lies spread on social media were reinforced by the strongman Duterte in the president's office, she explained. Quote, all of a sudden, our society was splintering. But Canada is different. Canada is immune from such deranged fevers, right? I might be more inclined to agree if we didn't have the example of Alberta. I like Albertans. I want the Alberta advantage to succeed for the Albertans. But something's gone down there in the last few years. In his drive to unite a divided conservative base, Jason Kenney drew from the Trump playbook by constructing a reality-defying threat to Albertans that all could rally against. The conjured enemy was environmentalists who dared suggest the oil sands were major contributors to climate change and energy transition should be a top issue in the province. Kenney empowered his government officials to bully critics and journalists online. He set up a war room to propagandize against oil sands criticism. Among its work, slamming the credibility of the New York Times and calling pernicious an animated children's film about saving creatures from oil pollution. Like some Soviet potentate, he set up a tribunal to find environmentalists and their supposed journalist allies guilty of crimes against the state. It was a boondoggle that fizzled, although the Tyee did get a summons. We didn't go. But he whipped up support among the anti-vaccination crowd by proudly defying the science behind other provinces' expert efforts to impose proof of vaccination and other health measures. Predictably, infection rates overwhelmed Alberta eventually, finally forcing him to act. But pandemics provide plenty of fodder for waging culture war. John Carlaw, a political scientist at Ryerson University, terms Jason Kenney's style, quote, a creative form of authoritarian populist politics. We saw where it leads the day last August a Grand Prairie man verbally attacked and intimidated Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who is half his size. He accused her of being a traitor, told her to get out of Alberta, and said later that he found the experience exhilaratingly satisfying. The episode directly arose, said political scientist Jared Wesley, from right-wing politicians who engage in, quote, rage farming by advancing false and misleading conspiracy narratives. Quote, they know how to feed those narratives, said Wesley, who teaches at the University of Alberta. What Kenney sowed, he reaped in the convoy revolts that blocked his province's border and in the loss of his job. He fed those narratives to a wing of the United Conservative Party that grew more and more radical and threw him out. Now it's led by Danielle Smith, a vaccine skeptic who denies the federal government's powers over her province enshrined in the Constitution. Alberta now has a premier who openly disparages the pretty reliably conservative corporate news media in her province. She has stated she prefers to trust small alt-right outlets. Everyone in Canada should keep a close eye on the tactics that Smith, building off Kenney, is employing in Alberta. Unfortunately, there will be fewer journalists in the province to do so. Last month, Postmedia issued an internal memo saying 12 of its Alberta newspapers would be stopping their print editions, and layoffs were coming soon. Is everybody just having a great time? We're almost done. So having spent an hour describing the heightening war on reality, what is it like today to be a journalist in the trenches? What is one's reward for carrying out the careful, methodical, unglamorous work that I've said serious journalism in the public entails? The short answer is that the work has become increasingly dangerous to journalists' mental well-being. Last year, the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma issued a survey-based report called Taking Care. Quote, what we found was an industry struggling to cope with job stress and exposure to trauma. Here are some of the report's findings. 1, media workers have spent the last 2 years reporting on the widespread impacts of a deadly virus, all while trying to navigate their own fears, isolation, and uncertainties. In return, media workers have become targets to an anti-vaccine movement intent on causing workers personal or professional harm. No media worker was immune from the COVID effect, but some reported greater degrees of stress, says the report, including women, people under 50 years old, and Asian, Black, and Indigenous workers. 2, even before the Freedom Convoy blockades, members of the media were already becoming a lightning rod for harassment and violence. Taking Care data shows that more than half of media workers are targeted, with women, non-binary, and trans people, as well as people of color, reporting alarming rates of harassment and violence. I can say personally, at the Tyee, it's a serious problem that we deal with. 3, media workers routinely run toward conflict, toiling among the details and graphic imagery of war, murder, sexual violence, humanitarian crises, natural disasters, and other crimes and calamities. The fast pace of our work makes it tough to properly process all that we witness on the job, says the study. 4, Canadian media workers' overall job satisfaction, despite all this, is high. In spite of the consequences, we are fortified by our mission to inform the public, says the report. But we're only capable of so much. And it's often our own well-being that gets left on the cutting room floor. Just 1/4 of taking care survey respondents said their mental well-being was good. 1 out of 4. With rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and high-risk drinking greatly exceeding Canadian averages. So those are all good reasons for no one to want to join the ranks of journalists in these difficult times. And yet, while it may surprise you that I've intended this talk this evening to be a recruitment appeal, that is why I stand here. Those of you in the audience who are young and contemplating taking up the craft and life of a journalist dedicated to the public interest, I strongly encourage you to do so. I can't promise the conditions will be any better than what I've described today. I cannot say for sure that I still believe Martin Luther King's guarantee that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. My thoughts about the work journalists do and why have evolved over the 40 years that I've called myself one. That's me when I was younger. I gave up smoking. Now that's actually Albert Camus, for people who don't know. My inspiration today is the character of Dr. Ryu in the novel The Plague, written by Albert Camus. A mysterious epidemic is sweeping through Ryu's town, and so his chosen role as a man of medicine takes on all the more urgency. Why does he expose himself to risk? Why not abandon the field? Why does he persist? His answer resonates with me for its sense of purpose, absent a clear path forward, for its humility. He persists without the rush of celebrity, the bursts of notoriety that our digital sphere delivers. He does so absent even the promise of reward in heaven. Ryu is an agnostic, and he is a doctor. And that is his calling. That is his job. And so he says, quote, I have no idea what's awaiting me or what will happen when this all ends. For the moment, I know this. There are sick people and they need curing. Close quote. For the moment, I know this. Our democracy is vulnerable and it needs journalists. Thank you.
We'll have a Q&A.
Why clap? That was really grim.
Well, it's better than
meeting?
Andrew Nikiforic's
It
joyful
was?
lecture last
okay.
year. Yes.
I had a lot of room to move in there.
So we just have a little bit of time left, and I'd like to offer it to those of you who would like to ask questions. We don't really have time for statements, but if you've got a question, yes.
Yeah, actually for both of you, what's the status of enrollment now in the journalism classes here and at Carleton?
Right. Our journalism, first year there's more than 100. But it does get quite a bit smaller. I think at around fourth year, you're looking at about 15 students. That said, we have a lot of good journalism that is coming out of UVic, especially long-form journalism. So students that are writing essays on the natural world, but I don't know that it's particularly lucrative for them. And quite a number of them actually have been published by you, Dave, in the Tyee.
Yeah, I mean, you can take some gauge from who's enrolled in journalism school, but a lot of people go on to jobs in public relations from journalism school or other areas. And so not everybody is destined to become the kind of public interest journalist that I described. And I would say there's probably about a cohort of 30 a year, I believe, in the graduate program at UBC, where I had the pleasure of teaching for a long time and actually taught with Deborah for a few years, which was great. I can tell you the fire is still there, the desire to do this work is still there. We need places for them to do the work. We need to build, a network of support and infrastructure so that they can do the work they want to do.
Other questions? Let's take it from a younger person. Yeah.
What skills would you advise cultivating for like a young person who wants to get involved in journalism? Like, what do you look for when you're looking to hire someone or looking for someone to write a story?
A natural curiosity about the world, an ability to be a fairly quick study, navigate the world of information and facts, but not miss key things or get things wrong. So you have to be a little bit bloody-minded, you have to be a little bit focused on detail. I think you're going to need some fire. You're going to need some determination. The path is not clear in journalism the way it is in law. In law, you do well in law school, and then you article, and then you're hired, and then there's like a ladder you go up. Same thing in medicine. Journalism looks more like a zigzaggy, I don't know, kind of a mouse on the floor looking for cheese or something. At least that's how my career looked. I don't know, some have done better. But there are many ways to be a journalist. There are many hats to wear as a journalist. So if you're okay with that sense that journalism gives you a passport, it gives you a ticket to cross borders, meet people, learn about other worlds, engage. Your mind is never bored. So it's a privilege to be a journalist, but you have to be able to live with that precariousness, I'm sad to say, in this day and age.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so for those of us who are in the writing program now, what would you say are the first steps that we should take once we graduate to get into this field?
Oh, okay. Well, arrive from the writing program having done a fair amount of reporting. And by reporting, it doesn't mean sticking a microphone in front of people. You can do a lot of reporting in the library. You can do a lot of reporting, reading books, but learn how to get outside of yourself and engage with information and people, and kind of humbly present yourself as a vehicle for their stories, which is a mindset that it's great to develop in school so that when you come out, you're ready to go with that. And then what I would say is pick an area of focus and do your early reporting and writing and reading in that area so that after a while you sort of own it, right? There'll be a big temptation to say, what do you got? What do you need? I'll do it. I write stuff. I went to the writing program. I write. I'll write it. But actually, it's more like, well, do you have a map? Do you know a territory? Do you know what the next big question is in that territory? Do you have sources? Do you know how to ask the smart questions? Are you on top of this particular area? And it could be puppy mills. It could be invasive species. It could be, breakthroughs in neuroscience, right? It's but commit yourself to one or two of those, I think, would be, and then pitch. Learn how to write a good pitch, and don't give up. It's you have to figure out a strategy for the first few years to do the catch-22, which is, I don't have any experience, and I know you want experience, but I can't get any experience unless you give me some experience. So you have to kind of tread water for a while, and you'll figure out how to do that financially. It could be mom and dad in the basement. It could be waiting on tables. For me, I wrote public relations copy for horrible people for a while, but just for 2 years.
Yes.
Right? So everybody's got their own strategy.
We've all been there. Yeah. Another question from the back.
If you're future for the print media, newspapers in particular, print newspapers, and also for broadcasting? I just read last night that the CBC is planning within a decade to go all online to stop the broadcasting.
Yeah. Broadcasting is a very expensive enterprise, but it's kind of a prestige enterprise. And of course, broadcasting creates nowadays little content nuggets that then roam around the internet, right? So it's hard to kind of, in my mind, it's harder and harder to split up all the mediums into separate streams. They all converge on the internet. They all produce content that ends up on the internet. This talk I gave today is going to be on the internet. It's going to be on the Tyee. So I think there will be broadcasts in the sense of video as a powerful medium, right? But whether there'll be the nightly 6 o'clock news that everybody gathers around like the family hearth, I'm a bit skeptical about that. Maybe we should poll the younger people in the room and how many make an appointment with the nightly news, right? Because my experience, yeah, you do? Okay. All right. And you're not just doing that because you want to get a job in journalism. Look, I'm going to write you the reference. You don't have to. Yeah. So anyway, you know, I don't know what to say. I'd say video journalism skills are going to become more in demand instead of less. Is about all I can say about that. Yeah.
Is there one more question?
I hate to bring a note of encouragement to this, but are you not somewhat encouraged by, yes, the market, the the hedge funds and those type of people have probably led to the demise of some of these big institutions.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there is an element of the market that is trashing people like Elon Musk. Look what's happened to his stock price since the stock price of Twitter.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are being taught a lesson by the market.
Yeah.
And there is, at the end of the day, the truth has come out about people like Donald Trump, you know, by some very good journalists like Maggie Haberman and people like that have known that guy all his, you know, adult life, essentially. So it seems to me that there is a market for that type of journalism still. Now, it's in big cities, perhaps. It's not going to solve the Victoria problem that you illustrate, but I think there is a room for some encouragement there.
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of innovative things that can happen. And I would like to see our government and our industry leaders send up a flare, sound the alarm, because our current approach, which is admirable at some level, it's much better than what some other countries are doing, but our current approach from the federal government is to give out very large wage subsidies to legacy media without demanding much transformation of that media whatsoever. And so basically you're subsidizing media that we've seen is being drained by a hedge fund. You know, you're subsidizing an industry which any money it makes goes into high interest loans to a US hedge fund. So how that's going to lead to new models in journalism, I'm not sure. You know, I think we have to get beyond that. I think there's some, you know, there's always opportunity in crisis. So one idea that I think is a no-brainer is to be ready to catch these newspaper chain titles as they fall. You know, if Postmedia is on the brink, what are we hearing from the federal government about what will happen to these really important entities? Yes, the Tyee competes with the Vancouver Sun, I guess. I don't think about it that way. I want the Vancouver Sun to succeed. I want my friends who work in that newsroom to keep working there. My view of it is that there should be financial instruments created, trusts that are incredibly incentivizing to philanthropists or people who want huge tax breaks or whatever in every local market that would be the logical receptacle once Postmedia wants to ditch the Vancouver Sun or whatever. It should be ready to receive it, and it should have massive advantages over just some rich person who wants to buy the paper and turn into a shopping wrap, right? But we don't think that way. We're not looking ahead. We're in a war, and we're not even thinking about how we're going to fight and win the next phase of it. So I agree with you, you know. If you're paying attention, it's not all bad news. And out of crisis comes opportunity. But I'd just like to see some bigger brain thinking about it. Yeah.
Thank you for giving us a lot of that today, Dave. It's been a great talk.
Thanks
yes.
so much.
Thank you.
I'll just say one more thing, which is that many times, and my partner's here, she can vouch for this. Many times I Googled, how many words in a 1-hour talk? Many times. And the range was 7,800 to 9,000. This is 7,800 words, and I went 12 minutes over. So it's just more proof of disinformation.